Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into something more ancient than your grandmother's forgotten perfume collection, the world of the ancient Romans during New Year's celebrations. And no, this wasn't like your New Year's Eve with fireworks, champagne, and a countdown. Oh no. The Romans had a whole ritual of offerings, prayers, and a ton of weird traditions that would make your 2026 resolutions seem like child's play. So before we take this trip to ancient times, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. I mean, no pressure, but your thumbs up might prevent the Romans from haunting us. Leave a comment and tell me what your strangest New Year's tradition is. You know, the weird stuff you do at midnight when no one's looking. Now dim the lights and get cozy, and maybe pull the blanket up a little tighter, just in case the ghosts of ancient Romans are still hanging around. Now let me ask you, ever wonder what it would be like to start the year by slaughtering a goat for good luck? Or maybe you've secretly wished you could get a glimpse of a Roman emperor stumbling home from a lavish banquet, toga all askew, while thinking they've got the power of the gods. What about those Romans who probably took a New Year's resolution so seriously they had to actually carve them into stone? Yeah, that sounds fun, right? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in ancient Rome. The year is 30 BC, and you're about to experience the chaos, luxury, and hilarity of how the Romans celebrated the new year. Good luck. The Romans had a calendar that could confuse even the most organized person. Imagine your year starting in the middle of January, or was it March, depending on which Roman emperor decided to mess with the dates that year. It was a calendar with more twists and turns than a reality show plot. It's like trying to follow a Netflix series where each season starts on a different date. Seriously, if you had a job as a Roman bureaucrat, your entire year could change depending on which emperor had their morning coffee, or if they overslept and needed to push the calendar a few days. So let's take a step back in time and try to make sense of this chaos. To understand just how messed up the Roman calendar was, we have to start with the basics. The year was supposed to be 365 days long, but instead of sticking to that, the Romans decided to mix things up and have a few leap years now and then. But here's the kicker. The leap years were not as straightforward as you might think. Imagine trying to explain to your kids why the calendar keeps changing. Don't worry, honey. We're just gonna add a random month to the year, okay? And the kids would probably respond, but Dad, it's already August, and you'd just be left staring blankly. That's basically what the Romans did. Except they didn't have TikTok to distract them, so they spent all their time arguing over which month to add. Let's talk about months for a second. The original Roman calendar had only 10 months. Yes, 10. Imagine having no January or February at all, just skipping straight from December to March. So when you were getting ready to ring in the new year, you could have been ringing it in the middle of winter or whenever they felt like declaring the start of the year. You'd start to wonder, is this the beginning of the year, or did I just miss it? A Roman citizen probably couldn't even remember if they'd celebrated New Year's already or not. Honestly, it was like trying to figure out if you missed a family holiday party because you never received the invite in the first place. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, Julius Caesar swoops in with his solution. In 45 BC, he reformed the calendar and introduced the Julian calendar. This new calendar was supposed to make things simpler, but even then, things weren't perfect. Julius decided that the year should start on January 1st. Great, right? The only problem was that he had to chop off a few months and create some leap years to get everything aligned. Suddenly, a year wasn't just 365 days anymore. Now it was 365.25 days. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by adding more water to the sink. Sure, you're fixing it, but the problem's still there. Julius didn't stop there. He was the emperor after all. And like any emperor with too much time on their hands, Julius thought, why not add some extra confusion? And so, a Roman year was born that wasn't so much a neat little 365-day circle, but more like a mishmash of solar and lunar adjustments. Of course, this meant that every few years, they had to fiddle with the calendar again, and that's where it really started to look like they were just guessing their way through it. So much for their standardized timekeeping. But the real kicker? The Roman calendar didn't always match up with the seasons. Imagine trying to plant your crops, and you're wondering if it's time because the calendar says spring, but it's still snowing. That must have been confusing and frustrating. Oh, I guess it's still winter, even though it says spring on the calendar. Well, time to eat some more stale bread and wait for the sun to catch up. The Romans had no idea that their calendar wasn't even close to perfect. In fact, the whole system remained so flawed that by the time the Middle Ages rolled around, Pope Gregory had to swoop in again with another calendar reform, the Gregorian calendar, just to make sure everyone was on the same page. By then, the Romans had been dead for centuries, but their confusing legacy lived on. Now here you are in ancient Rome, trying to navigate the chaos of the calendar while everyone else just sort of rolls with it. The emperor might decree that this year will be the best year ever, but no one really knows what that means when the calendar doesn't even know what month it is. You might think you're starting the year fresh, but it could just be the middle of the month. Who knows? The important thing is that you try your best, offer your sacrifices to the gods, and hope you don't get stuck on some random date in the calendar's never-ending mess. So the next time you curse your phone's autocorrect or struggle to understand daylight saving time, just remember that things could be worse. You could be living in ancient Rome, where the year starts whenever someone feels like it, and your entire sense of time is based on the whims of long-dead emperors. You think your schedule is hard to follow? At least you're not relying on a calendar that might or might not have a leap month thrown in every few years. Meet Janus, the two-faced god who ruled over transitions. Imagine having two faces, but only one job, to look back at the past while peering into the future. New Year's Day was his time to shine, as Romans would honor him to ensure that they had the luck and prosperity they needed. You'd think that being a god with two faces would make him pretty good at multitasking, right? But then again, considering that multitasking usually just means getting half of everything done poorly, maybe Janus had a bit of an unfair advantage. After all, he had two faces. He could totally pull off that whole looking at everything at once routine without ever actually having to choose a side. Talk about efficiency. Now picture it. You're a Roman citizen, struggling to make sense of the calendar that never quite lined up. You don't even know what month it is anymore, but at least you know that New Year's Day is all about paying tribute to Janus, the god who not only symbolized beginnings, but also has a whole monopoly on endings. Imagine walking into a Roman temple, all decked out in your finest toga, holding a goat, because it's always a goat, and offering it to Janus, hoping that his divine gaze would bestow prosperity upon your family. Meanwhile, Janus is looking in both directions, seeing all the messes you've made and all the potential pitfalls you're about to step into, and just shaking his head. But because he's a god, he can't exactly intervene. You're on your own. Still, it's a nice thought, right? But really, Janus had the ultimate job in the Roman pantheon. He was the first god to be invoked during every New Year's celebration. Every Roman, rich or poor, toga-clad, or in the middle of trying to figure out how the hell their calendar worked, would pray to Janus for guidance and protection for the year ahead. They hoped that by asking Janus to smooth the path, they'd avoid falling into any traps. And let's be real, the Romans were very good at falling into traps. They were experts at it. Whether it was getting stabbed by their best friend or marching off to some far-off land with terrible food, the Romans seemed to have a knack for making life harder than it had to be. And Janus, with his two faces, had a front row seat to all the drama. One face looked to the past. Think of it like looking in your reviewer mirror when you're already 5 miles down the road. You see the potholes, the wrong turns, and the times you should have just stayed home and binge-watched something. The other face, however, looked to the future. And what did Janus see? The future wasn't exactly crystal clear. There were wars on the horizon, power struggles, and of course, the occasional bad toga party where someone ended up a little too intoxicated and accidentally insulted the emperor. But Janus didn't have to worry about these things. He just made sure you kept your eyes on both sides and moved forward cautiously. In a way, Janus was the Roman version of don't burn any bridges while you're crossing them, but with a whole lot more goat sacrifices involved. Interestingly enough, Janus also had a temple in the Roman Forum that was often kept open during times of war and closed during times of peace. The opening of the gates signified that Rome was in a state of war, which is honestly a pretty ominous way to start the year. Imagine ringing in the new year with a god telling you, hey, things aren't looking great. Better prepare yourself for battle. Not exactly the most cheerful New Year's toast, right? Still, Romans believed Janus had a significant role in keeping balance, while also leaving them in suspense, because who doesn't love starting the year with some divine ambiguity? So, on the grand stage of Roman New Year celebrations, Janus was the star, but not exactly the most approachable one. His role was crucial, but also passive-aggressive, like a god who saw all your past mistakes and present hopes, but left you to figure it out. Maybe Janus was just ahead of his time, recognizing that looking back and planning ahead weren't just good habits. They were absolutely necessary for surviving the chaos of Roman life. There was something oddly comforting in knowing that, even though your future was unpredictable, a two-faced god was there to at least witness the madness unfold. As you go through your day, think about how often you look back at your own past decisions, weighing them against your hopes for the future. You might not have Janus's divine insight, but it's not a bad idea to reflect once in a while, because no matter what year it is, if you've got a little bit of awareness about where you've been and where you want to go, you're probably doing better than you think. Just remember to leave the goat at home next time. You don't really need it to make a fresh start, unless, of course, you're feeling particularly festive. When the Romans partied, they went hard. Imagine a feast where there's enough food to feed the entire modern world. They'd roast pigs, serve wine like water, and stuff themselves silly, all in the name of good fortune. It was like an ancient Roman version of a buffet, except no one cared about the calories, or the fact that the whole thing probably smelled like burnt meat and desperation. So if you've ever thought that a little overeating on New Year's Eve was a problem, just wait until you hear what the Romans did to kick off the year. Now, before we dive into the madness of this Roman food fest, picture the scene. You're walking into a grand hall. Well, it's not a hall really, more like a vast open space with rows of Roman citizens, all of them lounging on plush cushions, because apparently sitting at a table is too much work for an emperor. There are no neat little trays or plates with portions that make sense. Instead, food is sprawled out in glorious disarray, heaping in bowls and platters, with everything from honey-drenched figs to roasted flamingos. Yes, flamingos. Imagine a time when you could get away with cooking up an exotic bird just to show off how rich and classy you were. And let's not forget the pigs. Oh, the pigs. Roasting a pig at a Roman feast wasn't just a culinary choice. It was an event. They'd stick a whole pig on a spit, slow cook it for hours, and then proudly serve it up, the skin crispy and golden, while the aroma wafted through the air like some delicious torture device. At least, that's what it must have felt like for anyone who had to wait their turn. Imagine standing in a room full of hungry Romans, knowing that the pig is almost ready but not quite, while your stomach growls in what could be described as a peaceful yet gut-wrenching anticipation. But don't think this was just about the meat. Oh no, it wasn't just about eating. Romans knew how to pair their meals, and what better drink than wine? Wine was the beverage of choice for just about everything, from casual hangouts to major religious ceremonies, and New Year's celebrations were no different. Imagine cups of wine so plentiful that the Romans barely noticed when the wine was watered down, because they did water it down. It was more about the feeling than the actual taste. One sip, and you'd probably be sipping your way into a charming state of inebriation, grinning at the gods like, yeah, I get it, the New Year's here, let's party. And party they did. As the evening went on, the Romans didn't just eat and drink, they got loud. You'd hear the clatter of goblets, the giggles, the occasional chorus of drunken singing, and of course, the odd fight or two breaking out over who had the better seat. It was a carnival of chaos, and you could just imagine the level of drunken self-reflection that came with everyone trying to wish for a better year. I'm guessing most of those wishes were a little bit more about surviving tomorrow than about securing prosperity. As for entertainment, the Romans didn't skimp. When they weren't busy stuffing their faces, they were probably trying to entertain themselves with music, dancing, and the occasional contest to see who could hold the most wine in their belly without toppling over. It's a miracle anyone survived these feasts, honestly. Just picture yourself trying to stay awake at this chaotic gathering, juggling a plate full of roasted pork while the music plays in the background. You're tipsy, full of pig and wine, and absolutely not thinking about your New Year's resolution to stop eating so much. There was just no room for self-control when the gods of gluttony were calling. But let's not overlook the real reason for this indulgence. The Romans believed that by feasting like this, they would gain the favor of the gods. It wasn't just about stuffing your face for fun, though let's be real, that was a huge part of it. No, this was about ensuring that the new year would be filled with good fortune, prosperity, and blessings. By starting the year with an epic feast, the Romans hoped that the gods would take note and smile upon them, maybe even throw in a little extra luck, just in case the calendar mess-up didn't work out in their favor. And if you thought your modern-day New Year's buffet was over the top, think again. The Romans did it all while chanting prayers and pouring wine onto the ground as an offering to the gods, making sure their indulgence didn't go unnoticed by the divine powers. After all, who wants to start a year without a solid divine endorsement? So if you're planning your next feast, remember the Romans did it big, and they did it loud. Just don't expect to find any roasted flamingos or wine-soaked blessings in the modern world. But hey, the spirit of indulgence lives on in every buffet, right? Forget about hitting the gym or quitting sugar. Romans went all in with their resolutions. They would sacrifice animals to get their good fortune for the year. So if you thought your 2021 goal of drinking more water was ambitious, just wait until you hear about the Romans' sacrifice a goat plan. Picture it. New Year's Eve. The Romans are setting up their altars, ready to usher in the year with not just positive thoughts, but actual bloodshed. Forget the typical New Year, New Me. The Romans took their resolutions seriously, and if that meant slaughtering a goat to guarantee prosperity, then so be it. Now I know what you're thinking. That sounds a little extreme. I just want to get in shape, not throw a goat into the mix. But for the Romans, sacrificing animals wasn't just a matter of bad planning. No, it was a ritual meant to ensure a good year ahead. The idea was that by offering something valuable to the gods, usually a goat, pig, or even a bull, you were signaling your devotion and giving them a reason to shower you with blessings. It was like saying, "Look, I'm serious about this year. Here's a goat. Please, just make sure my crops grow and my enemies stay far, far away." Sure, that's a little more extreme than our typical resolutions, but it was probably more effective than any gym membership. And let's talk about the logistics here. Sacrifices weren't something you could just do casually, like texting a friend and saying, "Hey, want to join me for a sacrifice?" No, there was a whole ceremony involved. Priests were the ones who took on the dirty work. First, they'd purify themselves, because who wants to deal with bad jujube while making a goat sacrifice? After that, they'd kill the animal, often by slitting its throat, while saying prayers to ensure that the gods were pleased with the offering. Not exactly the peaceful New Year's Eve countdown we're used to, is it? But hey, the Romans didn't mess around when it came to asking the gods for favor. Imagine being part of a Roman family, gathering around to watch your relatives and friends sacrifice an innocent goat in the hopes of a prosperous new year. It's like being at a family dinner, but instead of turkey, you have a goat on an altar, and instead of your grandma asking you about your plans for next year, she's probably offering up a prayer to the god Janus, hoping he'll make sure the year ahead doesn't involve any more backstabbing or political intrigue. And you, still holding your wine goblet, would be thinking, maybe next year I'll just try something easier, like taking a walk every day. But for the Romans, these sacrifices weren't just for personal gain. They were tied to a much larger cosmic order. The Romans believed that when they made these offerings, they were ensuring the safety and prosperity of the state as well. It wasn't just about their own survival. It was about securing the empire's future too. These sacrifices were essentially Rome's version of a corporate vision board for the year. By appeasing the gods, they were promising a prosperous empire, both spiritually and materially. Sure, it was a little more complicated than simply posting a motivational quote on Instagram, but it did have a certain logic to it. Now, it's worth mentioning that not everyone was into animal sacrifices. Some people were simply too practical to believe that killing an animal would guarantee a successful year. But for the most part, the Romans went all in with this ancient form of New Year's resolution. If you were serious about your success, you were going to have to prove it to the gods. And what better way to prove your commitment than with an actual sacrifice? Meanwhile, back in modern times, you're probably sitting on the couch thinking about how you're going to fit in a workout routine between Zoom meetings. Maybe you even have a goal to eat less junk food, or finally learn how to cook something that doesn't come in a microwavable tray. But imagine what it would be like to start the year with a literal offering to the divine. Maybe a little less sacrifice and a little more sacrifice of time in 2021, right? But hey, you have to admit, there's something oddly charming about the Romans' commitment to their resolutions. They knew how to go big, and they weren't afraid of a little bloodshed to make it happen. So while you're nursing your second cup of coffee and thinking about getting back on track with your 2021 goals, just remember, the Romans were out there sacrificing goats, pigs, and sometimes even bulls, all to make sure they got what they wanted out of the year ahead. They didn't make half-heated resolutions. They made them with the gods themselves in mind. Maybe this year, you can up your game a little and commit to something that requires more than just a little self-discipline. Just please, no goats, okay? Ever had a dinner party where you were pretty sure you didn't want to be there? Well, the Romans took it to the next level. New Year's celebrations meant huge public banquets. Hundreds of Romans gathered in the streets to eat, drink, and then probably forget what they did after drinking too much wine. It was like the ancient version of a very awkward office holiday party, but with more toga-related accidents. You know the ones. The kind where you end up spilling your drink on someone's lap, but instead of apologizing, you just blame the wine. Because honestly, the Romans weren't really about personal responsibility when they were in full party mode. Imagine this. You're a Roman citizen, and it's New Year's Day. Your entire neighborhood is bustling with excitement, but instead of staying home, you're dragged out into the streets for what's essentially the Super Bowl of ancient feasts. These public banquets were held to honor the gods and ensure good luck for the coming year. The best part? Everyone in the community was invited, whether they wanted to be there or not. If you were Roman, chances were you weren't going to get out of it. You'd put on your finest toga, or, let's be real, the one that's least likely to have a stain on it, and head out into the bustling streets where tables and platters of food stretched as far as the eye could see. It was like an ancient version of all you can eat, except there was a lot more wine involved and considerably fewer options for people who didn't eat meat. At these banquets, it wasn't about keeping things neat and orderly. Oh no. It was about excess in all its chaotic glory. You'd see roasted meats, piles of fruits, bread galore, and wine that never seemed to run dry. The Romans didn't just serve one type of food, they went all in. If you wanted to get your hands on some peacock or flamingo, well, this was your moment. The higher the status of the banquet, the fancier the animals they served. But don't worry. The everyday Romans weren't left out. They could still enjoy plenty of bread, olives, and whatever else had been tossed together in an overly ambitious attempt at a feast. But it wasn't just the food that made these banquets wild. No, the real entertainment came in the form of the guests. The Romans were masters of the have another glass of wine philosophy, and with every drink, the atmosphere became a little less dignified and a little more, let's say, improvised. Conversations started off as polite chatter, but soon things turned into wild, exaggerated stories about family matters, politics, or the latest gladiator match. Some guests would start singing, some would dance, and a few would probably end up losing their toga or dignity, sometimes both. And as if that wasn't enough, there were always a few accidental incidents. Perhaps someone took their wine a little too seriously and tripped on the uneven cobblestones, landing with their face in the salad. Or worse, someone might have mistaken their neighbor's plate of food for their own and ended up eating the wrong thing, creating a ripple of awkward confusion. It's like a game of who's in charge of the dip, but instead of chips, you're eating lamb and peacocks, and the dip is really just a river of wine. The whole thing turned into a blur of laughter, drunken rambling, and inevitably, a lot of regrettable decisions. The best part? This wasn't just a small local gathering. No, this was a public event. Imagine a parade of food, music, and revelry spreading across the entire city, with Romans packing into the streets, all there to partake in the massive feast. There were no VIP sections, no exclusive guest lists. Everyone from the emperor to the lowliest street vendor was invited to partake in the festival. You didn't have to bring a gift or make a reservation, just show up and eat until you couldn't remember your own name. As the feast went on, the Romans would start to drift into a semi-conscious state. The whole concept of moderation went out the window, as did any sense of personal space. By the end of the evening, people would stumble home, their bellies full, their minds fuzzy, and their togas twisted in the most bizarre ways. It was like a giant ancient New Year's party where no one remembered what had happened by the time they woke up. But the Romans weren't worried about hangovers. No, they were just hoping that by the time morning came, they'd been blessed by the gods for the year ahead. Now imagine waking up the next morning, your head pounding, your toga in complete disarray, and your stomach still digesting that peacock you ate 5 hours ago. You don't remember most of the night, but you know you probably danced with a senator and may have insulted the priest who led the sacrifice. But guess what? The Romans didn't care. They just shrugged it off and started preparing for next year's feast, where they could repeat the cycle again. So while you're sipping your coffee and staring at the aftermath of your own New Year's celebrations, remember this. The Romans took over the top to a whole new level, and they did it in public for everyone to see. It wasn't just a feast. It was a chaotic, drunken, toga-filled extravaganza that still holds a certain charm. Next time you find yourself at an office holiday party, just imagine if that was how we celebrated the new year. How many peacocks would you need to start the year off right? While you might jot your goals down in a planner or use a trendy app, the Romans took their New Year's resolutions way more seriously. They'd carve their wishes for the year into stone. Yes, actual stone. You couldn't back out of that commitment without a chisel and hammer. And let me tell you, breaking a resolution carved into rock is not as easy as it sounds. Forget about swiping left on your resolution app when you're having a lazy day. The Romans' resolutions were etched into solid rock, making it a bit more challenging to just forget about them. Picture it. You've just declared to the gods that you will be a better person this year. No more bad habits, no more laziness. You're going to be the Roman equivalent of a fitness influenced. And instead of a cute interest board, you're sitting in front of a slab of stone with a chisel, carving your promises into it, all while knowing that there's no turning back once that stone is marked. Now you may be thinking, but I'm just trying to lose a few pounds. I don't need to be etching my personal goals into a giant rock. And I get it. That sounds intense, but the Romans, They weren't about to half-ass it when it came to resolutions. If they promised to be better in the new year, they were doing it with full commitment. We're talking about literal inscriptions, like "This year, I will be more patient," or "I'll stop gossiping about Marcus." There was no delete button, no "oops, I forgot to make this resolution." No, once your wishes were chiseled into stone, the pressure was on, and if you slipped, well, everyone knew about it. Talk about accountability. The real kicker, though? The Romans didn't just write down their resolutions for personal success. They also got the gods involved. It wasn't enough to simply carve your aspirations into rock. You had to take those goals to the gods, praying and making offerings to ensure you kept your promises. Imagine trying to keep up with your New Year's fitness routine while also making sure you're on the gods' good side by offering up a few goats. It wasn't just about you staying on track. It was about making sure divine forces backed you up. And in ancient Rome, the gods were watching, waiting to see if you followed through. If you didn't, well, that's when bad luck started to feel a little too real. Talk about a cosmic pressure to succeed. And speaking of the gods, there was a bit of a ritual surrounding these New Year's resolutions. The Romans would make their promises to gods like Janus, the god of beginnings, transitions, and doorways. He was basically the ancient equivalent of a motivational speaker who'd tell you, "This is the year you make it happen." So when you carved your goals into stone, Janus was there, making sure that you kept your word. Imagine trying to break a resolution, knowing that Janus was peering at you with his two faces, one looking back at your past failures and the other, well, giving you side-eye as you try to sneak in that extra piece of cake. It was a whole lot harder to avoid the gods when you were literally walking under their gaze. Then there's the sheer drama of actually getting your resolution carved into stone. This wasn't a quick jot in a notebook. It required effort. First, you'd need a piece of stone, then a steady hand, and a chisel. This wasn't a task for the faint of heart. It was a year's worth of promises, it being immortalized in rock. You'd better have known exactly what you were committing to, because those words were going to be there for all eternity, or at least until the stone crumbled into dust. It's kind of like writing your goals in permanent ink, but on steroids. Sure, you might make a list of 10 things you want to do this year, but are you willing to chisel them into stone? Probably not. In modern times, the idea of making a serious, tangible commitment to your goals can feel a little fluffy. Well, I wrote it in my planner, so it's official. But imagine standing in front of a slab of stone, hammer in hand, knowing that if you didn't stick to those goals, you'd be dealing with not only your own disappointment, but the wrath of the gods as well. You'd probably think twice before making those sweeping promises about eating fewer donuts. Now here's the best part. In a twist of Roman practicality, these carved resolutions weren't just for personal development. They were often placed in temples or public spaces where anyone could see them. You weren't just committing to the gods, you were committing to the entire community. The pressure was on, not just from divine forces, but from the entire city. It's like saying, "I'm going to work out every day," and then posting it on a billboard for the whole world to see. Imagine the social accountability that came with having your resolutions on public display. There was no way to skip leg day without someone in the marketplace asking about it. So while we're over here setting reminders on our phones and starting fresh with a cup of coffee, the Romans were out there chipping away at stone, carving their futures into the very fabric of their empire. Their resolutions weren't just written, they were etched into history. If you want to feel a little more serious about your own goals this year, take a page out of their book. Just maybe skip the stone carving. And the whole wrath of the gods thing, that might be a bit much. Roman politics weren't exactly known for their warm and fuzzy vibes. So while you were trying to enjoy the party, the whispers of power struggles and betrayal were always in the air. Imagine trying to toast to your health while silently wondering if your best friend was plotting to overthrow the government. Yeah, not the relaxing start to the year you were hoping for. You've got your wine in hand, the roasted meats are sizzling on the table, and the festivities are in full swing. But all around you, there's a thick undercurrent of political tension, like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. It wasn't just a party, it was a minefield of alliances, shifting loyalties, and the occasional assassination plot, all masked by the joyful noise of a New Year's celebration. Good times, right? The Romans didn't just celebrate with wine and food, they celebrated with power plays. This was a time when everything could change in the blink of an eye. Imagine being at a feast with friends, only to realize halfway through that half of them are only pretending to be your friend while secretly scheming against you. You couldn't even trust a toast. What if someone had poisoned your wine? It wasn't unheard of in Rome. In fact, the whole keep your friends close and your enemies closer thing was practically a rule of thumb when it came to Roman politics. Everyone was smiling, making toasts, exchanging pleasantries. But underneath it all, you could feel the tension. There was always that possibility that someone, somewhere, might be working behind the scenes to stab you in the back. Not exactly the relaxing holiday vibe, right? Now add in the fact that the emperor and his cronies had a way of throwing their weight around. If the emperor was in attendance at the New Year's feast, it wasn't just a time for revelry, it was also a display of power. The emperor had a habit of reminding everyone of just how divine they were, and that meant a lot of pressure on the common folk. You'd have to worry about what you said, what you did, and who was watching because a single misstep could send you straight to the gladiator pit, or worse. At any given moment, an emperor could decide they didn't like the look of you or your family, and suddenly, poof, you were out of the picture, erased from history like a forgotten scribble in the sand. It wasn't all toga-wearing fun and games. There was real danger lurking under every festive surface. And here's the kicker. The people who you thought were your friends, they were probably the first ones to turn on you. One minute, you're laughing with your fellow senator, sipping wine, exchanging stories of good fortune. The next minute, you're hearing rumors of a coup and realizing that your best friend has been scheming to take your position. Even the most trusted allies weren't immune from betrayal. It was like an ancient reality show, but instead of drama-filled confessionals and elimination rounds, you had knives in the back and power struggles that could end in public executions. Nothing says, Happy New Year, like being dragged through the streets and executed for a crime you didn't commit, or worse, a crime you didn't even know existed. The political tension was everywhere. At these New Year's banquets, you weren't just celebrating the start of a new year, you were also playing a dangerous game of survival. Imagine trying to enjoy the feast while keeping one eye on your drink, wondering if someone was going to slip poison into your goblet. At the same time, you'd be watching the others in the room, calculating how much they could be trusted. Would they sell you out to further their own political career? Would they turn their back on you the moment they thought they had the chance to climb the social ladder? In a world where the politics were more cutthroat than a knife fight in a back alley, trust was a luxury you could never really afford. And while you're trying to juggle the social faux pas of New Year's with the constant threat of betrayal, remember, Rome was built on power, and power was a game that everyone played. So when you clinked your glass for good fortune and a prosperous year ahead, you weren't just hoping for good health. No, you were silently praying that your enemies wouldn't find an opening to take you down. You were toasting to survival. The whole thing was less about celebrating new beginnings and more about ensuring you made it through another year without a dagger in your back, or worse, a public scandal that would see you dragged through the streets of Rome, humiliated in front of the very people you once called allies. So as you sip your wine and enjoy your modern-day New Year's party, maybe take a moment to appreciate the fact that you can toast to good health without wondering if someone is waiting to ruin your life. Sure, your friends might be gossiping about who's dating whom or who didn't make it to the party, but at least you don't have to worry about plotting your own political survival just to make it to January the 2nd. Ah, how times have changed. The Romans didn't just give gifts to their friends during New Year's, they gave them to the gods. Statues, food, and even sacrifices were left at shrines to honor the deities. Imagine giving your boss a token of appreciation that you actually think might save you from a bad year at work. For the Romans, that's what a New Year's gift was, a bribe to keep things from falling apart. Forget about giving a gift just to show you care or because it's expected. The Romans had one goal in mind when it came to gifting: appeasing the gods. If you didn't get it right, well, you could end up with a really bad year. So as you're casually walking past your coworker's desk this year, offering a gift card to a coffee shop, just remember that your Roman ancestors were probably offering statues of their gods or even animals to ensure divine favor. The idea behind these votive offerings wasn't just about making the gods feel appreciated. No, it was more like a strategic investment. If you wanted a good year, you had to ensure the gods were on your side, and you did that by making them feel special. Want good crops? Offer the gods some grain or a nice piece of fruit. Hoping for a successful military campaign? You'd better have a bull or a goat ready for sacrifice. It was like running a divine customer service program. Dear gods, here is my gift, and in return, please don't make me suffer through crop failure or a brutal war that I can't win. In other words, the Romans weren't so much giving gifts out of the kindness of their hearts. They were making sure the gods had every reason to look favorable upon them. Kind of like giving a really generous tip to your waiter, only your waiter is a god who can control your fate for the entire year. One of the most common votive offerings was a small statue or image of a god, often left at a shrine or temple. Imagine walking into your local Roman temple with a small bronze figurine of Jupiter, god of the sky, and placing it carefully on the altar, hoping that it would convince the god to bless you. That's right, this wasn't just about thinking positive thoughts and hoping for the best. It was about giving the gods tangible offerings. You were basically saying, look, I gave you something nice. Now please do your part and make sure my year goes smoothly. It's like paying for a VIP pass to the universe's most exclusive club and hoping it gets you all the perks, like a good harvest or smooth business dealings. The Romans also gave offerings of food, and not just any food. We're talking about the good stuff: wine, a spread, honey, and even cakes made specifically for the gods. They weren't going to offer up a stale loaf of bread or some leftover scraps. No, This was high-quality food, and it had to be presented in a way that showed how serious you were. This wasn't a throw it in the temple and pray for the best situation. No, no, no. They made sure everything was as pristine as possible, with proper rituals for preparing and presenting these gifts. So imagine being invited to a feast, but instead of giving your favorite relative a box of chocolates, you're giving them a whole roasted pig, a bottle of the finest wine, and asking for the universe's blessings. It's over the top, but it's also a very real way to guarantee the gods knew you were serious. Then, of course, there were the sacrifices. If you really wanted to make sure the gods were listening, you'd go all out with a sacrifice. Sacrifices could include a variety of animals, such as goats, sheep, and sometimes even cows or pigs. Picture the scene. The entire community gathers at the temple, the priests prepare the animals, and the ritual begins. The sacrifices weren't just about killing animals for fun. They were seen as a sacred offering that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. The belief was that by sacrificing something valuable, you were giving a part of yourself to the gods, asking them to bless you in return. It's like handing over your favorite coffee mug in exchange for a year of good fortune, except the coffee mug was a goat, and the gods might decide you get blessed with abundance, or smite with plague, depending on how well the ritual went. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just about the gods you were trying to impress. These gifts also showed your commitment to the community. Think about it. When you showed up with a beautiful statue of Mars, or you presented your finest honey cake, you were demonstrating not only your devotion, but also your wealth and status. Offering the best to the gods wasn't just about being pious. It was also a sign that you had the resources to contribute. Everyone was watching, so if you wanted to maintain a good reputation, you'd make sure your offerings were worthy of attention. In the grand scheme of things, the Roman approach to New Year's resolutions and offerings was practical, yet steeped in divine drama. It was a way to cover all your bases, making sure that nothing bad would happen to you and that the year ahead would be full of blessings, favor, and success. And let's face it, who wouldn't want that? A little divine intervention to ensure your plans go smoothly? That's the kind of gift that keeps on giving. So as you prepare for the new year, maybe take a lesson from the Romans. Just don't go around sacrificing goats, unless you're really feeling bold. But hey, a well-timed prayer or good intentions might not hurt either. During these massive celebrations, Roman women were tasked with throwing their own parties. But in a truly Roman fashion, their role was mostly to organize the festivities and then be ignored during the more important rituals. It's like being asked to organize a surprise party, only to find out you weren't invited to the actual celebration. Imagine being the one responsible for setting up the grand banquet, picking the food, decorating the venue, making sure the guests have everything they need, only to find out that once the celebrations start, you're shooed away while the men are honored and lavished with attention. That's the Roman woman's role during the New Year's festivities, and unfortunately, it wasn't limited to just the New Year. It was a common theme throughout Roman life. The task of hosting these New Year's celebrations would often fall to women, particularly those in the upper classes. They were expected to organize everything down to the smallest detail, from arranging the best entertainers to ensuring the wine flowed freely. Women had their hands full in making sure everything ran smoothly. However, despite their central role in setting up the festivities, they were often pushed to the sidelines during the actual ceremonies. The women's work in organizing and managing the event was valued, but when it came to the rituals, They weren't exactly the ones making the sacrifices or participating in the high-stakes prayers that were believed to influence the coming year. That honor, it went to the men. This separation of roles wasn't unique to Roman New Year's celebrations. It reflected the broader societal views that placed women in the background of public life, even when they were essential to its success. Women were expected to maintain the home, care for the children, and manage social gatherings, but they were generally excluded from political, religious, and military matters. For the Romans, men were the ones who participated in public rituals, performed sacrifices, and offered prayers to the gods. Women's contributions were often reduced to domestic and social duties, leaving them with little recognition for their efforts in creating the very event everyone was attending. So while women were busy putting together lavish feasts, selecting the finest meats, making sure there were enough olives and honey cakes for everyone, and arranging for entertainment to keep the guests happy, they weren't always included in the more serious aspects of the celebration. Picture it, women carefully preparing everything, but once the wine flowed and the sacrifices began, they were expected to step back and watch as the men performed their roles. It must have been quite a sight, being at the heart of the celebration, organizing the food and drink, but not being allowed to participate in the actual fun, the prayers, or the religious rites. Imagine being told, "Thanks for setting it all up, but now go, sit over there while we handle the real stuff." Talk about a frustrating experience, right? To make matters even worse, women in ancient Rome didn't have the luxury of being just invisible during these occasions. They were often expected to adhere to very strict social codes. If a woman tried to get too involved in the festivities or the religious rituals, it might be seen as improper or even disrespectful. Women were supposed to be the quiet, behind-the-scenes organizers, not the front and center celebrants. So while the men were out there leading sacrifices and making the all-important toasts to the gods, the women were expected to quietly celebrate their roles as silent contributors. But if you think about it, wasn't their role even more important? Without the planning and execution of the feasts, none of the ceremonial stuff would happen at all. The gods certainly wouldn't be pleased if there was no food or wine to offer, right? As frustrating as it may have been for these women, it's important to note that their power lay in the domestic and social spheres. Women were still the keepers of tradition, the ones who ensured that the rituals, however sidelined they were, ran smoothly. They were the invisible backbone of these grand celebrations, without whom everything would have fallen apart. The New Year's celebration might have been a public event, but it was the women who created the environment in which it thrived. In today's terms, think of it like this. Imagine being the event planner for the biggest party of the year. You coordinate every little detail, get the best decorations, hire the entertainers, make sure everything is perfect. And then, when the event starts, you're told you're not allowed to attend. You're in the background, not even allowed to join in on the fun you worked so hard to create. It's no wonder these women may have started to feel like their hard work was undervalued, because it was. But they carried on, anyway, ensuring the celebration went off without a hitch, quietly supporting their families, their society, and the traditions that defined Roman culture. So as you relax and enjoy your New Year's celebration today, consider the role of the women who, like their Roman ancestors, are probably the ones making sure everything goes smoothly behind the scenes. Let's just hope they're actually invited to the party this time. Lupercalia was a festival of fertility and fun held just before New Year's, and it was a wild ride. People dressed in animal skins, whipped each other with straps, and exchanged favors. Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of a very inappropriate Valentine's Day, but with more nudity and animal pelts. Picture it. The streets of Rome packed with revelers, dressed like wild beasts, running amok with more energy than a caffeine-fueled squirrel. Everyone was celebrating fertility, love, and life, or at least the promise of a good harvest and a thriving family. It wasn't your average New Year's preparation. If you thought your New Year's Eve had gotten a little crazy in the past, you'd be seriously outdone by the Roman Lupercalia festival. The Lupercalia festival, which took place in mid-February, was originally meant to honor Lupercalia, the god of fertility, and it had some pretty outlandish rituals. First off, the priests known as the Lupercalia would sacrifice goats because, well, what's a party without a sacrifice, right? These goats weren't just slaughtered for fun. They were seen as an offering to the gods for good harvests and fertility. Imagine being at a modern-day festival and having to offer up your lunch to a deity before the music starts. Only in ancient Rome would that be a totally normal thing to do. But the fun didn't stop there. After the sacrifices were made, the priests would strip the skins off the goats, fashion them into whips, and run around the city. Yes, you heard that right. Whips made of goat skin. And then, just to top off the absurdity, they would whip anyone who was in their path, men, women, children, because it was believed that being whipped by the skins of sacrificed goats would ensure fertility and a prosperous year ahead. Imagine trying to get through your day, walking in the streets, when all of a sudden, someone in a loincloth comes running at you, brandishing a goatskin whip. "Happy New Year!" they might shout, just before leaving you with a red welt as a souvenir. Talk about a very hands-on approach to good luck. And yes, the whippings weren't reserved for the priests. The Lupercalia festival was all about random and spontaneous exchanges of, well, let's just call them favors. The most bizarre tradition was that young women would often line up and place their names in a box, which was then drawn by young men. The pairs would be matched up for the duration of the festival, and they were expected to indulge in whatever festivities might come their way. For some, this meant a night of unbridled revelry, and for others, it meant a chance to mingle with someone new, perhaps even an unlikely romantic partner. The Roman version of speed dating, but with the added bonus of animal pelts, sacrificial goats, and an intense sense of chaos. The wild nature of Lupercalia was rooted in the belief that the fertility god Lupercalia would ensure abundance for the community, but the festival was also a social release valve. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of letting off some steam. The upper classes, the lower classes, and everyone in between participated in the revelry. It was a day for the city to come together in an unrestrained, sometimes reckless, celebration. The boundaries of normal social structures were relaxed. After all, who was going to enforce rules while people were running around dressed like half-naked animals, waving goatskin whips and calling for fertility blessings? It was like the ultimate anything-goes day, where even the strictest Roman would find themselves getting swept up in the frenzy. But it wasn't all just fun and games. In the midst of all this chaos, there was a serious side. Lupercalia was believed to cleanse the city, bringing about fertility and health for the coming year. The sacrifices, the rituals, and even the wild whippings were all part of the same grand plan to ensure the empire thrived. In a way, it was a kind of divine insurance policy. Don't perform the ritual correctly, and you risk the wrath of the gods. The Romans took their beliefs seriously, even if their methods seemed a little out there by today's standards. Now let's be real for a second. If you were a Roman, you'd either love or hate Lupercalia. There would be no middle ground. Either you were going to get whipped by a priest wearing a goatskin tunic, or you were going to watch others do it, probably with a goblet of wine in your hand, laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. It wasn't a quiet, dignified festival like some of the more solemn Roman observances. It was raucous, wild, and completely off the rails, just like any good Roman celebration should be. So the next time you find yourself stressing over your New Year's Eve plans, take a deep breath and remember that it could always be worse. You could be in ancient Rome, gearing up for Lupercalia, dressed in animal pelts, whips in hand, hoping for fertility and good fortune, and of course, trying to dodge that goatskin-wielding priest coming your way. Just a little different from your typical New Year's celebration, right? What's a Roman New Year's celebration without a little bloodshed? Gladiatorial games were the ultimate form of entertainment, and they were part of the festivities. Picture this. You're sitting there, trying to enjoy your roast pig, while some poor gladiator is having a very bad day in the arena. Maybe your New Year's isn't looking so bad after all. After all, you're not the one in the sand pit, covered in armor, trying to fight for your life against a wild animal or a fellow gladiator. At least that's the kind of entertainment the Romans thought would spice up their holiday celebrations. While we might prefer watching fireworks or awkwardly singing Laud Lang Syng, the Romans got their kicks watching men, and sometimes women, fight for their lives. It wasn't just a party, it was an exhibition of strength, survival, and brutal spectacle. The gladiatorial games, which were held in massive arenas like the Colosseum, weren't just for special occasions. Of course, during the New Year's festivities, they were bigger, louder, and bloodier. These games were often held to honor the gods and ensure prosperity and peace for the empire. So when the Romans wanted to really kick off their year with a bang, they filled the arena with all sorts of violence. It was like the Roman version of extreme sports, but with a lot more blood and a lot fewer safety regulations. Now, these weren't your everyday backyard brawls. No. The games were serious business. Gladiators, most of whom were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, would face off in brutal combat. They were trained to fight, sometimes with swords or tridents, and sometimes even armed with nets to try and entangle their opponent. The audience would cheer as the fighters went head to head, and depending on their performance, the crowd could decide their fate. A victorious gladiator might get a standing ovation and a palm branch, but if he failed to impress, the outcome could be far worse. The power of the crowd was real, and a single thumbs down could send a gladiator to an untimely death. And it wasn't just one-on-one combat. Oh no, the Romans were all about variety. Some games involved team fights, where gladiators would face off in squads, working together to take down opponents. It's kind of like a blood sport version of a rugby match, except much, much more lethal. And let's not forget the wild animals. These gladiatorial games were notorious for their inclusion of beasts, lions, tigers, bears, and even elephants. The Romans would release these animals into the arena, where they would fight against the gladiators or other animals. It was a spectacle of nature and human prowess, where the odds of survival weren't just against the gladiators, but against the very beasts they had to fight. Imagine being part of that audience, sitting in the stands with your wine and snacks, cheering as a gladiator takes down a lion, all while thinking, maybe I'll skip the gym tomorrow. I've got a good excuse now. The games could go on for hours, sometimes even days, depending on how much blood the crowd demanded. As the New Year's celebrations progressed, it became clear that the Romans had a much more literal understanding of ringing in the new year. For them, it wasn't about a quiet toast. It was about celebrating strength, courage, and survival in the most visceral way possible. And when the games were finally over, it was time to relax and enjoy the rest of the festivities, but not before contemplating what you just witnessed. It wasn't easy to forget the brutality of the games, especially if you were one of the lucky or unlucky ones who had been in the stands while watching someone perish before your eyes. As the blood-soaked festivities wound down, the Romans would often retreat back into their homes, perhaps with a glass of wine in hand, contemplating the triumph of life over death. Sure, the New Year's games might seem barbaric by modern standards, but to the Romans, they were a reflection of the values that made their empire so mighty: strength, endurance, and a fierce will to survive. It was all about showing the gods and each other that they could face any challenge, no matter how dangerous. It's hard to deny that there's a certain kind of grim beauty in that. So as you prepare for your own New Year's celebration, probably with a glass of champagne and a cozy blanket, remember that for the Romans, the beginning of a new year was an all-out spectacle of violence, strength, and endurance. It wasn't about sitting around the table with loved ones, sharing resolutions. It was about watching survival unfold in front of your eyes, knowing that the outcome of the games might be the very thing that shaped the year ahead. If anything, it definitely gave the term New Year's resolutions a whole new meaning. The Romans didn't take chances when it came to the gods. They knew that keeping the gods happy meant keeping their life in order, at least for a while. So before popping that cork of wine, they'd make sure to offer up prayers and sacrifices, just in case the gods were feeling extra cranky that day. It wasn't just about saying please to the universe and hoping for the best. It was about actively appeasing powerful, unpredictable deities who could make your life either wonderful or a total disaster. Think about it. You want a good year? Then you'd better start with a proper offering. You weren't just asking for good fortune. You were bribing the gods, making sure they didn't turn their backs on you or smite you with a year of bad crops, plagues, or worse, your toga getting stuck in the chariot wheel during a public procession. Every Roman knew that divine favor was a currency, and it wasn't one you could afford to run low on. This was especially true during their major celebrations, like the New Year's festivities. Before anyone could indulge in a feast or toast to the future with wine flowing freely, they had to first acknowledge the gods. This wasn't just a quick cheers to the heavens before getting drunk. It was a ritual, complete with prayers, sacrifices, and the kind of solemnity usually reserved for a wedding or a royal coronation. Think of it as the Roman version of starting the new year by paying off your credit card debt before you get the party started. You don't want to have a wild celebration only to find out the gods are sending you a financial catastrophe. So before the feasting began, it was time for some serious divine business. The gods were fickle, and Romans didn't want to risk angering them. The Roman pantheon was populated by a whole host of deities, each responsible for different aspects of life. There was Janus, the god of beginnings, transitions, and doorways, who was invoked at the start of the new year asking him to open the doors to a prosperous future. There was Jupiter, king of the gods, to whom sacrifices were offered to ensure protection and good fortune for the empire. The list goes on. Mars, the god of war, for military success. Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, for a fruitful harvest. And Venus, the goddess of love, for romantic bliss. The Romans didn't just celebrate, they petitioned the gods for everything they thought could go wrong and right in the coming year. These offerings weren't just symbolic, they were meant to be generous. The more you offered, the better your chances of receiving divine favor. So before you could dive into your New Year's party, you'd find yourself at a temple, standing with a goat or a pig, preparing for a public sacrifice. You'd make sure the gods knew you were serious about your future by handing over something valuable. Don't just bring a handful of figs, bring the best stuff. Bring a golden statue, a perfectly cooked lamb, or maybe even a ceremonial bull. The larger and more extravagant the offering, the more likely the gods would be to smile upon you. Imagine trying to get your New Year's wish granted by throwing in a half-eaten sandwich. Now that's bad planning. So the Romans made sure their offerings were nothing short of grandiose. Once the offerings were made and the prayers recited, the celebration could begin. But don't think the gods just forgot about the gifts. They were always watching, always listening. If your sacrifices were sincere, the gods might bless you with a year of success, good health, and wealth. But if you skimped on your offerings, or worse, if you broke your resolutions, the consequences could be dire. The gods didn't just sit in their lofty thrones, ignoring the plight of mortals. They were active participants in the lives of the Romans, and their favor was something you earned through acts of devotion. It wasn't enough to have the right words. You had to prove that you were truly worthy of divine support. Of course, not all gods were about major sacrifices. Some deities, like the household gods, known as the Lars and Penetrates, were more about daily offerings. You didn't have to kill a goat to please these gods. Sometimes a simple dish of food or a candlelight prayer in your home was enough to keep them happy. Those smaller offerings were meant to protect the everyday aspects of your life, your family, your home, and your personal well-being. But when it came to the big events, the public festivals, the feasts, the celebrations of a new year, that's when the grand gestures came into play. It's safe to say the Romans didn't have a set-it-and-forget-it mentality when it came to the gods. They understood that keeping the gods happy was an ongoing process. So while you might be toasting to a prosperous year ahead, just know that your good fortune depended on the divine balance you kept, one offering at a time. So next time you make a resolution, remember, a little sacrifice, whether metaphorical or literal, might go a long way. You don't have to kill a goat, but a little prayer or a kind act never hurt anyone. If you thought your local wedding planner had it tough, try being a Roman priest during New Year's. They were the ones who kept the rituals in check, ensuring that sacrifices were made and that the gods were appeased. They basically managed the whole New Year's chaos, while you and I would be busy fighting with the parking attendant. Imagine for a moment being a Roman priest tasked with overseeing a New Year's celebration that included massive sacrifices, drunken feasts, and a million potential ways to upset the gods. You'd have to be part spiritual guide, part event coordinator, and part peacekeeper, all while trying not to get caught in the crossfire of a crowd fueled by too much wine and bad decisions. It was the kind of job where the stakes were high, the pressure was constant, and no one really appreciated your efforts unless something went wrong. The job of a Roman priest, especially during the New Year's celebrations, was no small feat. Priests weren't just in charge of religious ceremonies, they were in charge of the entire celebration. While the rest of the population was throwing themselves into the revelry, the priests were running around, making sure every ritual was done correctly, every sacrifice was made according to tradition, and that the gods were sufficiently honored. This was no casual gig. They had to ensure that the complex web of offerings, prayers, and feasts unfolded seamlessly, or else the entire year could be cursed. Picture it like being the person who has to make sure all the guests at a party are happy, the food is hot, and the entertainment is on point, except with the added pressure that if you screw up, the gods might punish everyone involved. It's a little more intense than just managing the playlist and the guest list, right? Let's break it down. The priests would begin by preparing the sacred space for the sacrifices, typically at a temple or a shrine. The animals had to be properly chosen, usually goats or pigs, and meticulously prepared for the ritual. If you've ever been involved in an event where you had to coordinate last-minute changes, imagine doing that while also making sure you're dealing with sacred rituals and appeasing divine beings. There was no room for error. Every prayer had to be said in the exact right order, every offering had to be placed in the right spot, and every action had to be executed with complete precision. One slip-up could be catastrophic. For a Roman priest, keeping things running smoothly meant balancing the will of the gods with the demands of the crowd, and not getting trampled or accidentally sacrificed in the process. On top of the logistical nightmare that was managing sacrifices, the priests also had to maintain a calm, composed demeanor while the party raged around them. Imagine trying to keep order while a sea of toga-clad Romans are drunkenly trying to join in the ceremonies, or worse, disrupting the carefully planned offerings. The priests had the difficult task of keeping everyone in line, making sure the rituals were performed according to strict rules while avoiding the kind of chaos that would make the gods angry. If people weren't behaving, or if the sacrifices weren't up to the gods' high standards, it was the priest's job to step in and fix it. That's a level of responsibility most party planners can't imagine. But then again, party planners today don't have to worry about whether their actions will lead to divine wrath or a bad harvest. They just worry about the reception hall. And like any good event coordinator, Roman priests also had to keep the crowd engaged. After all, this wasn't just a ritualistic event. It was a festival, and it had to be fun. They would often lead chants, prayers, and sometimes even performances to keep the crowd's spirits high, ensuring that they stayed in the right frame of mind to receive the gods' favor. Picture it like being the MC of a wedding, but with the added pressure of being a priest who must ensure that the gods are pleased with the festivities. The pressure was high, and the margin for error was thin. One slip in the performance of a ritual, and it wasn't just bad party vibes. You might just have ruined the entire year for Rome. But while the Roman priests were the ones holding everything together, they often didn't get much credit for their hard work. The emperor and other public figures received the recognition, while the priests were left to handle the messy business behind the scenes. Sure, they might have enjoyed a bit of recognition from the gods, but in terms of public applause, not so much. The real reward for a priest was the successful execution of the rituals, ensuring that the gods were happy and that everyone else could have a good time. After all, their role wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about making sure that the spotlight didn't crash down on the party, bringing ruin with it. So, next time you're organizing a party, think about the Roman priests. They were the true event planners, not only keeping the party running, but ensuring that the fate of the entire empire rested on their shoulders. The next time you stress about making sure your catering arrives on time or your playlist is just right, remember that a Roman priest was making sure your entire year's fortune wasn't about to go up in flames, and maybe they were doing it while trying to avoid a goat in the process. Talk about stress. Picture the streets of Rome during New Year's, Romans in togas, wine in hand, shouting at each other in the streets, some of them probably getting lost in their own backyards. It was a bit like New Year's Eve in the city today, only with more toga-related wardrobe malfunctions and less Cuber. The streets were a spectacle of chaos, with a mixture of merrymaking and drunken stumbling that made modern-day celebrations look tame by comparison. While we might fret over finding the best place to ring in the new year, Romans were more concerned with getting their toga straight, not falling into a pothole, and dodging a random stranger who might try to offer them a drink from their cup, because why not? Everyone was in the mood to share, and while modern celebrations tend to focus on the countdown, the Romans took a more leisurely approach. The entire celebration was a sprawling, wild affair. There was no midnight to wait for. Rather, the festivities could last the entire day and well into the night, with the streets bustling with Romans who were either recovering from their earlier indulgences or diving into the party head first. These were the days before organized transportation, so people didn't worry about getting home. They worried about finding their way home after several too many cups of wine. Getting lost in your own backyard wasn't out of the question, especially when you had a toga to manage, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly designed for efficient movement. One moment, you're heading to the temple to make an offering to the gods, and the next, you're trying to get your toga knotted while figuring out where you left your sandals. Togas, by the way, were the official dress code for most of the Roman population, and while they looked elegant when worn correctly, they had a tendency to go a little sideways as the drinking intensified. Imagine trying to keep your toga draped just right while stumbling around, avoiding random, spilled wine from other partygoers, or sidestepping one of those infamous wine-soaked accidents. If you thought keeping your New Year's outfit intact was tough during a busy party, try doing it in a toga while navigating the crowded, slippery streets of Rome. The risk of getting caught in a wardrobe malfunction was high, and no amount of wine could ease the embarrassment when you were essentially walking around in a giant piece of cloth that refused to stay in place. And let's be real, you were far too tipsy to care until the morning after, when you woke up with a crumpled toga, a hangover, and a vague memory of getting tangled up in it. The real magic, though, was in the crowd. The Romans were known for their lively street culture, and there was no better time for it to shine than during the New Year's festivities. Picture dozens, maybe hundreds, of people gathered together in the street, all in varying stages of drunkenness, shouting greetings, trading stories, or perhaps starting an impromptu dance. Think of it as a giant, chaotic block party with zero inhibitions. It didn't matter if you were a senator, a merchant, or a slave. New Year's was a time to throw off your social status and join the public celebration. Sure, you could always drink in your own home, but there was something about the streets of Rome on New Year's that brought out a level of collective joy and an utter disregard for the usual rules of civility. If you were a Roman, you celebrated in the streets, making it a communal experience where boundaries were blurred and personal space was non-existent. And then there were the accidents. With so much wine flowing, the streets of Rome were bound to be filled with mishaps. It's one thing to lose your balance and spill a drink in the privacy of your own home, but doing that while strolling down a public street in front of a crowd, that's the stuff of legend. As the evening wore on, the wine and revelry made it inevitable. Someone, somewhere, was going to trip, spill, or fall into someone else's feast. With the streets lined with food, music, and revilers, it was more of a chaotic spectacle than a serene festival. You'd be walking along, thinking everything was fine, when suddenly a raucous chorus of drunken singing broke out. Maybe a fellow partygoer bumped into you, sending your wine splashing across someone's toga, leading to an awkward apology and a polite, tipsy laugh, before the same accident happened all over again a few minutes later. If you weren't in a toga, you were probably in sandals, shuffling through the cobbled streets of Rome, doing your best to stay upright. Yet, it was all part of the fun. No one cared if they tripped or spilled their wine. They were too busy laughing and enjoying the company of friends, family, and strangers. It was the epitome of the Roman festive spirit. No structure, no shame, just unrestrained merrymaking. In fact, the more out of control the celebration seemed, the more it aligned with the Romans' idea of a successful New Year's celebration. Life, in all its messy glory, was to be embraced, not avoided. So as you sip your drink this New Year's Eve and prepare for the countdown, take a moment to consider what it would have been like in ancient Rome. No Umber rides home, no organized events, just the chaos of the streets, togas flying, wine spilling, and a sense of community in its most unrefined form. The Romans knew how to let loose, and somehow they made it work. Just remember to hang on to your drink and maybe keep an eye on your toga. The Romans weren't overly ambitious with their prayers. They didn't ask for fame or fortune, just the basics: a good harvest, peace, and survival. It's kind of like asking your boss for a raise, but only if they won't make you do more work for it. Simple, but with very high stakes. Picture it. The Romans would gather around their altars, carefully offering up their sacrifices, murmuring their prayers for a prosperous year ahead. But let's be real here. No one was asking for riches or power. They just wanted the basics: the crops to grow, the empire to remain at peace, and their families to make it through the year without some catastrophic plague or an emperor deciding they were due for a little purge. It wasn't so much about getting everything you wanted, but about keeping what you already had. And that was a tall order in the Roman world. Now think about it. You're standing at the altar, preparing to offer up something to the gods. Maybe it's a goat. Maybe it's some fresh fruit, or perhaps it's a good old-fashioned prayer. You're not asking for a windfall of wealth or a sudden rise to power. You just want your crops to grow so you can feed your family. You hope for a few peaceful months, free from the threat of invasion or war. You pray that your health holds up, and maybe you cross your fingers that the emperor doesn't get any weird ideas about you and your family. But the stakes? Huge. There's no plan B for bad harvests or political upheaval, so the gods' response to your prayer was everything. It wasn't just about what you prayed for, it was how you prayed. The Romans took their rituals and ceremonies seriously. These prayers weren't casual conversations with the universe. Oh no, they were deeply formalized events, where every action, word, and offering had to be just right. A prayer to Jupiter, king of the gods, for peace had to follow an exact protocol. You couldn't just wander into the temple and throw up. A quick request for good weather. You had to show the gods you were serious. Precise language, appropriate sacrifices, and solemn intent. This wasn't the time for half-heated wishes. If you wanted the gods to listen, you had to offer something real, whether it was an animal, food, or even a carefully spoken vow to uphold your duties as a Roman citizen. Let's not forget the divine hierarchy. The gods weren't just sitting around waiting for your prayer. They were busy running the universe, and they had preferences about how they were approached. There were a whole range of deities to petition, each with their own specific areas of expertise. You'd pray to Ceres for a good harvest, Mars for military success, and Venus for love and fertility. But if you really wanted to cover all your bases, you'd have to make sure to honor each of these gods in their proper place and time, or else you might miss out on that all-important blessing. It was like a divine checklist. Miss one, and you could find your year falling apart faster than you could say bad omens. But the Romans were smart about their approach. They knew how to hedge their bets. If you didn't want to risk missing out on any divine favor, you'd go big. Large public sacrifices were a common way to secure the gods' attention. Picture it: a lavish banquet with sacrifices, prayers, and offerings galore. Imagine your family standing together, offering something of value to the gods, hoping that by doing so, you'd avoid bad fortune. The Romans believed that their relationship with the gods was a two-way street. You give, and the gods will give back. If you put in the effort to properly honor them, they were supposed to reward you with favor. That's why every prayer, every sacrifice, every ritual was so important. Mess it up, and you might as well have started the year with a curse. Now, as a modern person, you might wonder, what's the big deal? Why not just hope for the best and see what happens? But for the Romans, hope wasn't a strategy. They were practical people who understood that life was fragile and that every year could be a gamble. They didn't have weather forecasts or reliable crop insurance. They had the gods, and that was all they could count on. So when it came time to pray, they weren't taking chances. They knew that the success of their entire year could hinge on whether the gods decided to be merciful or vengeful. It was like having one shot at securing a good future, and if you missed it, well, you could be facing famine, war, or worse. As New Year's rolled around in ancient Rome, the streets were filled with sacrifices and prayers as Romans took their chances on the gods. They weren't greedy, just realistic. They didn't need it all. They just needed enough. Enough peace, enough food, enough health to get by. And honestly, isn't that what most of us want for the year ahead? The Romans knew that life was unpredictable, and the best you could do was make your intentions clear and hope that the gods were in a good mood. So as you get ready for your own New Year's celebration, think about the Romans for a second. They didn't ask for the moon, they just asked for survival. If only their gods had a better track record of keeping promises. The chariot races were a big deal, like really bigs. The Romans would gather in the Circus Maximums, cheering on their favorite team of charioteers, all while sipping wine and hoping they wouldn't get crushed by a speeding chariot. It was like NASCAR, but with more horses and a much higher chance of dying. The Circus Maximums, an enormous oval-shaped stadium, could hold up to 250,000 spectators, nearly 1/4 of the population of Rome. Imagine that. A sea of people packed into one massive space, all there to witness chariot races that were as much about adrenaline as they were about betting, blood, and sheer spectacle. The race itself was a high-speed, dangerous, and thrilling affair. Charioteers, often slaves or prisoners, were put through brutal training to master the art of driving a chariot pulled by 4 or more horses at breakneck speeds around a track with tight turns and minimal space. The stakes were high. One wrong move could send a chariot flying, leaving its driver in a heap of dust and broken bones. For the audience, this made the race both exciting and terrifying. There was no protective barrier between the chariot and the crowd, so if one of those massive thundering wheels veered off course, it wasn't unheard of for the poor spectators to get caught in the chaos. It's not like you could just text your friend to warn them about the crash. Nope, you were fully immersed in the heart-pounding drama unfolding right before you. The races themselves were a blend of strategy, skill, and sheer luck. A typical race featured 4 chariots, each representing a different team with their own loyal fan base. Just like today's sports fans, the Romans were deeply loyal to their charioteers and their teams. The charioteers would race around the track 7 times, trying to outmaneuver each other while also avoiding the occasional pileup or a competitor's dangerous tactics. It wasn't just about speed, it was also about control, and this was where the real excitement lay. A charioteer could easily go from the front of the pack to last place in the blink of an eye if they made the wrong move or got caught in a crash. And trust me, crashes were frequent. The risk was not only to the drivers, but also to the horses. These majestic animals, used to pulling chariots in the Roman games, were running at full speed, often under extreme pressure. If a horse was unlucky enough to fall or be pulled down by a rival's chariot, it was a tragic sight for the crowd. The Romans, like modern-day sports fans, were accustomed to both victory and defeat, but unlike modern sports, the consequences were often far more gruesome. It wasn't just the human competitors who were risking their lives, it was the animals too. But in the heat of the moment, the crowd didn't care. They wanted blood, they wanted a show, and the charioteers delivered. The atmosphere at the Circus Maximus was electric, with the crowd constantly cheering, shouting, and even throwing things. It wasn't uncommon for them to get riled up and make noise to influence the outcome. Some fans might even get so invested in the race that they'd shout insults at the opposing teams or the charioteers themselves. In a way, the excitement mirrored the modern-day sports fanaticism, but with a few more dangerous elements thrown into the mix. And let's not forget the wagers. The betting was fierce, and many Romans would gamble away everything they had on their favorite charioteer. A win could mean riches, while a loss could leave you with nothing but regret. It was the ultimate high-stakes game, where fortune could shift in an instant. But as you can probably guess, not all of these races ended in glory. For some, the final lap meant disaster, crashes, horses falling, and charioteers tumbling into the dust. The sound of the crowd's collective gasp when someone went down, or worse, when a chariot veered off the track, was deafening. The charioteers had a brief moment of fame and glory, but for many of them, their careers were short-lived. Injuries were common, and a quick fall from the top could easily turn into a permanent exit from the arena. Despite the dangerous nature of the races, they were a vital part of Roman culture, representing not only the Romans' love for spectacle, but also their desire for order and discipline, attributes that the Roman Empire prized. The races were a reflection of the Roman ethos, the thrill of competition, the power of the gods, and the reminder that even the mightiest of charioteers were at the mercy of the gods, fate, and their fellow competitors. So as you're settling in for your own New Year's celebrations, perhaps with a little champagne and a comfortable seat, just remember, the Romans were celebrating their new year in a far more extreme way. They were watching chariots race at insane speeds, cheering as charioteers risked life and limb for their amusement. And while modern celebrations may seem tame by comparison, they were in the end celebrating the same thing: a new year, a fresh start, and the hope that this year, at least, you won't get a chariot to the face. During these New Year's celebrations, Romans didn't just offer sacrifices, they whispered silent prayers to the gods, hoping that they wouldn't upset them too much. It was like trying to get a favor from someone who's already annoyed at you, but with way more incense. Imagine this. You're at a lavish Roman celebration, surrounded by feasts and revilers, but before you can join in the merriment, you have to sneak off to a quiet corner, light some incense, and whisper your deepest wishes to the gods. You want good health, prosperity, and peace for the year ahead. But you also want to do all of this without the gods noticing that you're subtly asking them to play nice this time around. The Romans understood something that modern-day celebrants often forget. While it's important to celebrate, it's just as crucial to keep the gods on your side. They believed that the gods were active participants in every part of their lives, every decision, every move, and yes, every new year. And as much as the Romans loved a good festival, they knew that their success in the year ahead didn't just depend on their efforts, it depended on keeping their divine patrons happy. So while the wine was flowing and the animals were being sacrificed, there was a quieter, more reserved side to the celebrations, the whispered prayers. This wasn't about public display. It was a personal, often private moment where the individual would seek favor from the gods. The silent prayer was typically a low-key affair, a whisper barely louder than the sound of the wind, directed toward the heavens in the hope that the gods would hear it. The gods weren't easy to impress. No amount of incense or whispered words could guarantee their favor. After all, they were gods, not your local shopkeeper offering discounts for good behavior. You couldn't just hope for a good year, you had to put in the work. It was a delicate balancing act, trying to ask for a favor while also avoiding angering the very deities who could make your life a living nightmare. The prayer might go something like this: Jupiter, mighty god of the sky, please grant me a bountiful harvest this year. Or, perhaps a little more anxiously, Mars, god of war, may you keep the empire safe, but please no wars this year. I'd rather not deal with that, thanks. You'd whisper these prayers into the air while you offered up your sacrifices, hoping that the gods could hear you, and just as importantly, that they didn't remember any past transgressions. See, Roman gods weren't like the forgiving kind of deities we think of today. They held grudges, long, unyielding grudges. If you'd angered them before, they weren't just going to forget about it. A few too many mistakes, and you could find yourself suffering the consequences in the form of bad crops, disease, or even war. So it was important to be humble, respectful, and, most importantly, subtle. Now, this isn't to say the Romans didn't know how to cover all their bases. The public rituals and sacrifices were important, but there was something uniquely personal about those whispered prayers. You could throw a massive feast to honor Jupiter, but there was something about a heartfelt prayer whispered in the quiet of a sacred temple or at a shrine to your household gods that felt more direct, more intimate. In a society that was as public and organized as Rome, this private form of worship allowed individuals to speak directly to their gods, hoping they'd listen and offer their blessings. It was the Roman equivalent of sending a direct message to your boss, asking for time off. Sure, you're doing your part in the office, but you've got to make sure your request gets the right attention at the right time. As these prayers were often made quietly, in the shadows of the grand festivities, the act itself was surrounded by an air of reverence and fear. You had to make sure your words were perfect, your intentions clear, and your offerings sincere. To make a request of the gods and to be ignored, or worse, rejected, was considered a sign of poor fortune, and no one wanted to start the year off with divine neglect. So amidst the raucous celebrations of the new year, there was a quiet undercurrent of fear and respect, as Romans sought to keep the gods on their good side. It was a reminder that even in a world filled with laughter and wine, divine favor wasn't something to be taken lightly. And while it might sound a little strange to us today, these silent prayers were an integral part of the Roman New Year tradition. They reflected the deeply ingrained belief that human actions, good or bad, could be influenced by divine forces. You could throw the biggest feast in Rome, but without appeasing the gods through prayer and sacrifice, you might as well have been setting yourself up for failure. The Roman New Year wasn't just a party. It was a way to guarantee that the year ahead would be full of blessings, and at the very least, free from any disasters the gods might throw your way. So next time you find yourself setting your New Year's resolutions, maybe take a moment to reflect on your own silent prayers. While you might not be offering sacrifices or lighting incense, the tradition of hoping for a better year remains the same. Just be sure to keep the gods happy, and don't forget the wine. Imagine a politician giving a speech about the new year that's mostly about how they're going to make things better, while also acknowledging that everything is kind of a mess. That's what the Roman emperor did. Their speeches were a mixture of promises, empty gestures, and the occasional reminder of how powerful they were. Very nothing to see here, but also I'm the emperor, so listen up. These speeches were as much about maintaining the emperor's grip on power as they were about offering any real solutions. In fact, if you ever wondered what it would be like if your elected leaders spent their New Year's speeches doing a weird mix of humble bragging and deflecting, then you'd be in for a treat with a Roman emperor's address. The emperor's New Year's speech wasn't just a casual affair. It was a highly orchestrated event, one carefully crafted to maintain the appearance of control while subtly reminding everyone that no one else had any real power. It was like a blend of a motivational TED Talk and an episode of The Bachelor, where the emperor has to promise the people everything they want while still making it clear that he's the one holding the rose, or in this case, the imperial skeptic. The emperor would stand in front of a crowd, probably looking pretty grand in their ceremonial attire, and launch into a speech that promised peace, prosperity, and of course, the divine favor of the gods. But underneath all that smooth rhetoric, you could tell there was a hint of, but don't forget, I'm in charge here, hanging in the air. What was remarkable about these speeches is that the emperor couldn't just get up and say, everything's great, we're all winning. In fact, that would have been absurd. The truth was, the Roman Empire was often a hot mess of political corruption, military unrest, and economic struggles. So the emperor had to navigate the tricky balance of convincing everyone that the empire was on the path to greatness, while also acknowledging that it had its share of issues. This is where the deflecting came in. The emperor would acknowledge some of the empire's problems, be it unrest in the provinces, food shortages, or the occasional power struggle within the Senate, but would quickly turn the conversation toward how great things could be under their leadership. It's like saying, sure, the country's a bit of a mess, but trust me, I've got this, all while flexing your political muscles in front of the crowd. No need for specifics, just the promise of better days, thanks to the emperor. And speaking of flexing political muscle, the emperor's speech would almost always come with an embedded reminder of just how powerful they were. They'd drop subtle references to their military victories, their divine right to rule, or even their ability to bring peace to the empire. Sometimes, they'd even call upon the gods to validate their rule. The audience would be expected to nod and cheer, reaffirming that they believed their emperor's divine favor was what kept them from total chaos. It was the political equivalent of throwing in a "I know a guy who can help," but with far more grandeur. The emperor's speech was an exercise in reminding the people of their power, but with a humble twist, where every victory was wrapped in the language of divine destiny. Every failure was someone else's fault, and the emperor's actions were always framed as for the greater good. Despite all the pomp and circumstance, the emperor's New Year's speech wasn't all about self-congratulation. In fact, there were elements of humility, or at least an attempt at it. The emperor would often express gratitude for the loyalty and hard work of the people, praising their efforts in securing the empire's stability. This was key. The emperor had to present themselves as both a benevolent ruler and a military genius. It wasn't enough to simply be in charge. They needed the people to believe that their success was tied to the emperor's leadership and wisdom. This balance was delicate. Too much humility, and the emperor could seem weak. Too much boasting, and they risked appearing disconnected from the struggles of ordinary citizens. Now let's bring this into a more modern perspective. Imagine if modern politicians gave speeches with the same blend of grand promises and pointed acknowledgement of their own power. Maybe they'd start by acknowledging the country's issues. Maybe they'd even mention the economic downturn or a recent scandal. But instead of providing a concrete plan, they'd focus on their previous achievements and assure everyone that everything was going to be amazing. It's a bit like when your boss tells you about all their strategic plans for the year ahead, but doesn't actually give you any tangible details. The emperor's speeches weren't exactly transparent, but they got the job done in a way that kept the crowds happy and their loyalty intact. The average Roman citizen might not have walked away from the speech thinking, "Wow, I know exactly how this is going to work." But they sure knew that their emperor was in charge, and that was enough. By the end of the speech, the emperor had usually done enough to remind everyone why they were the one who got to wear the imperial purple and sit on the throne. Whether the year ahead was going to be filled with good times or turmoil, the emperor made sure that they controlled the narrative. And for the Romans, that was all they really needed to hear. After all the celebrations, the Romans had a very real hangover. It wasn't just from wine either. It was from the massive amounts of food, the prayers, the sacrifices, and the overwhelming sense that they might have made some bad decisions. Sound familiar? It's like every January the 2nd for the rest of us. Imagine waking up after a wild night of feasting, praying, and possibly making questionable life choices, only to realize that the New Year's celebrations weren't just about the food and the fun. They were about appeasing the gods and securing your place in the empire. And now, with the party over and the wine-slicked streets empty, you're left with a few too many regrets, a belly full of roast pig, and a vague sense of dread about what the gods might have in store for you. The hangover wasn't just physical. Sure, you'd probably have a killer headache from all that wine. But more than that, you'd have the spiritual and emotional aftermath of what just happened. In ancient Rome, the New Year wasn't just about shaking off the old year and welcoming the new. It was a serious affair, one where the gods had to be kept happy, and you had to make promises to both the divine and the people around you. After all the public sacrifices, whispered prayers, and offering your best food to the gods, there was that nagging feeling that you might have forgotten something, or worse, offended someone. One of the things the Romans did in the aftermath of their New Year's revelry was to reflect on the past and make amends for their mistakes. You see, their New Year's was not just about celebrating the future. It was about erasing the bad karma of the previous year and ensuring that they weren't going to repeat their errors. The Romans believed that if you didn't properly honor the gods or make the right sacrifices, the year ahead could be full of disaster, plagues, famine, or worse, a failed harvest. So after a night of wild celebration, they'd wake up the next day with a heavy heart and that overwhelming pressure to ensure they had done everything by the book. No amount of wine could dull that feeling of responsibility. The physical hangover was inevitable after a night of feasting, drinking, and celebrating. The Romans knew how to throw a party, but they also knew how to drink a lot. There's a reason the word debauchery has been associated with ancient Rome for centuries. These guys knew how to party hard. After the food had been consumed, the wine had flowed freely, and the sacrifices made, many Romans would wake up with that familiar feeling of having overdone it. The pain of a wine-fueled headache and the exhaustion from staying up all night were only amplified by the fact that they had to get right back into the grind of the year. The rituals and public events didn't just stop because it was the 1st of January. They were part of a greater cycle that couldn't afford to skip a beat, even if you had a pounding head and a stomach that was still processing yesterday's excess. But then, of course, there was the mental and emotional hangover, the realization that the rituals and sacrifices might not have been enough. Had they pleased the gods? Did their prayers get heard? What if they forgot to offer the right kind of sacrifice, or perhaps they didn't light enough incense at the shrine? The pressure of not getting it wrong was real. If something bad happened in the coming year, it was easy to assume that maybe they had messed up in their rituals. Imagine waking up and realizing that despite all the food, the wine, and the grand public spectacle, you might have left some important detail out, or worse, you might have angered one of the gods by not offering enough. The Romans weren't just worried about their bank accounts or job prospects, they were worried about divine retribution. And let's be honest, that's a much heavier thing to wake up to on New Year's Day. So what did the Romans do in the aftermath of the New Year's hangover? Well, much like today's modern resolutions, they'd get back to work. They'd start their day with a visit to the temple to offer any remaining prayers or sacrifices they might have missed the night before. It wasn't enough to just let the festivities end. They had to keep the momentum going, ensuring that their year would be blessed. After all, no one wants to spend the year with a sense of impending doom, constantly worrying if they've angered the gods and what misfortune might be lurking just around the corner. The most important part of all of this was a sense of renewal. The Romans used the first day of the year as a kind of spiritual reset. The feasting, the sacrifices, the prayers, it all built up to this moment of hopeful expectation for the year ahead. But after the wine had worn off and the last slice of cake had been eaten, the reality of making good on those prayers settled in. And much like us today, the Romans probably faced a few hiccups in their resolutions. The first day's prayers and sacrifices might have been followed by days of disappointment, but that didn't stop them from trying again. After all, no one had a perfect start to the year. The point was to try, to offer up something, to make amends, and to hope that the gods would have mercy on your drunken, overfed soul. So the next time you find yourself nursing a New Year's hangover, think of the Romans, who weren't just dealing with a headache and a bloated stomach. They were dealing with the weight of appeasing the gods, the pressure of starting a new year with divine favor, and the nagging feeling that maybe they hadn't done everything right. At least you don't have to worry about the wrath of Mars or Jupiter when you wake up and try to recover from your own indulgences. So here we are, as the Romans did before us, another year, another opportunity to celebrate, reflect, and yes, maybe recover. As you tuck into your clean, comfortable bed with heating, soft sheets, and the simple joy of not having to appease any gods before turning in, take a moment to think back on how much easier our lives are today. Unlike the Romans, we don't need to spend hours praying, sacrificing, or trying to keep the gods from turning their wrath upon us. Instead, we just ask for a better year, armed with our resolutions, a little champagne, and the hope that things will turn out as planned. The Romans, with all their sacrifices and prayers, had a level of commitment that's hard to imagine in today's world. They knew that every new year came with the weight of expectations from the gods, from society, and from themselves. Their celebrations were as much about appeasing those higher powers as they were about enjoying the moment. The feasts, the wine, the gladiatorial, games, and even the awkward hangovers were all part of this delicate dance of survival, happiness, and hope. As you settle into the comfort of your modern life, remember that the Romans, for all their grandeur and spectacle, weren't so different from us. They, too, faced a new year filled with uncertainty, challenges, and the desire for something better. The prayers, the sacrifices, and the wild celebrations were all efforts to ensure that the year ahead would be filled with good fortune. And in many ways, that's no different from the hopes we all have as the clock strikes midnight, whether it's for health, happiness, or simply surviving the chaos. So tonight, as you enjoy the quiet comfort of your home, remember the Romans and their raucous celebrations, their wine-filled revelry, and the prayers whispered in the shadows. Maybe there's something to be said for the quiet moments of reflection in the midst of all the noise, for the balance between enjoyment and responsibility, and for the simple act of wishing for a better future. Because history may be full of chaos and excess, but it also shows us how resilient people can be, finding hope, laughter, and purpose, even in the messiest of times. Take a moment to appreciate the luxuries we have today, from indoor plumbing to delivery apps that save us from wandering aimlessly through our own backyards. No matter what the new year brings, we're already doing better than the Romans in one regard. We're not waking up to divine judgment in a year full of sacrifices. So rest easy and let the lessons of the past inspire you to make your own resolutions without the worry of a toga malfunction or an angry god. And with that, here's to a fresh start, a smooth year ahead, and the hope that it will be filled with more joy than hangover. Okay, good night.